Please, help me redeem my mama's bracelet. Before Edward Hale could even react, the little girl pressed a folded $50 bill into his hand. Edward blinked in confusion and looked down at the money resting in his palm. Please, sir, she said quietly. I saved it. Edward frowned slightly. I think you've made a mistake, he replied gently. The girl shook her head immediately. No, sir, I didn't. She pointed toward the glass display case behind the pawnshop counter. My mama's bracelet is in there. Edward followed her finger. Inside the case were several small pieces of jewelry arranged neatly on black velvet. A silver chain, a turquoise ring, a man's wedding band, and near the corner, a slim gold bracelet. Edward looked back at her. I'm sorry, he said calmly, but I don't know you. I just walked in here. I came to look at a few old items the owner sometimes gets. He held the $50 bill out toward her. You should take this back. But the girl didn't move. Instead, she gently pushed his hand back toward him. No, sir, she said. You keep it. Edward studied her face for a moment. Why would I keep your money? So you can help me. Behind the counter, the pawnshop owner let out a slow sigh. She came in about 15 minutes ago, Frank said, leaning his elbows on the glass. Says she wants to buy the bracelet back. The girl quickly opened the small cloth pouch she was holding. Coins spilled across the counter quarters, dimes, nickels, and a few wrinkled $1 bills. I have more, she said quickly. See? Edward glanced down. How much is all that? $87.23, she said carefully. I counted it 3 times. Frank shook his head. The bracelet's $800. The girl lowered her eyes briefly. I know. Edward leaned slightly against the counter, studying her. What's your name? Annie. And where's your mother right now? At home, she said softly. Looking for work. Edward nodded slowly. And why exactly do you think I should help you? Annie blinked at him. Well, because you look like someone who could. Edward glanced at the bracelet again. Kid, he said gently. Do you know how many people ask me for help every week? Annie shook her head. A lot. Edward nodded. A lot, he repeated. People with stories. People who need money. People who are in trouble. He lifted the $50 bill slightly. And I don't know who you are. The girl stayed quiet. So tell me something. Edward continued calmly. If I help you, what do I get in return? Frank looked up, curious now. Annie thought for a moment. Then she said quietly, my mama's smiling again. The answer hung in the air. She hasn't smiled the same since she sold it. Annie continued. She thought I was asleep last night, but I heard her crying. She said the bracelet was the last proof her life used to be beautiful. Annie whispered. But we needed the rent money. Edward exhaled slowly. You walked here alone? Yes, sir. It's only 5 blocks. You shouldn't be walking around by yourself. Annie shrugged. Sometimes kids have to fix things when grown-ups can't. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Frank cleared his throat. Actually, he said, reaching under the counter. There's another problem. Edward looked up. Frank unlocked the display case and carefully lifted the gold bracelet out. He held it in his palm. Guy called about this piece earlier, Frank said. Collector. Said he might come by before closing. He placed the bracelet on the counter between them. So if nobody here can buy it, Frank continued, glancing from Edward to the girl. I'm probably selling it tonight. Annie's eyes widened. But that's my mama's, she said softly. Frank sighed. Kid, in this place, everything used to belong to somebody. Edward slowly reached forward and picked up the bracelet. The gold felt cool against his fingers. He turned it slightly, studying the thin links. It was simple, elegant, clearly worn often. The metal had that smooth shine that only came from years against someone's skin. Then he flipped the clasp over, and everything inside him stopped. Tiny letters were engraved along the inside curve. E.M. Always choose love. The pawn shop disappeared around him. Memories suddenly rushed back. Rain on a university sidewalk. A young woman laughing beneath a shared umbrella. A velvet box opening in his trembling hands. The bracelet sliding onto her wrist. Edward slowly lifted his eyes toward Annie. His voice had changed when he spoke. Kid. He paused. What did you say your mama's name was? Edward Hale still held the bracelet when Annie said the name. Marissa Brooks. The gold links trembled slightly between his fingers, but Edward heard none of it. All he heard was the name, Marisa. He lowered his eyes to the inside of the clasp again. E.M. Always choose love. The engraving was small, almost hidden. Only the person wearing the bracelet, or the person who had given it, would ever think to look there. Edward had ordered it himself 18 years ago, back when he still believed courage and love were the same thing. "Mr. Hale?" Frank Rivers' voice pulled him halfway back to the room. Edward blinked. "What?" Frank leaned forward slightly over the counter. "You look like you just saw a ghost." Edward didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at Annie. "You said your mother's name is Marissa Brooks?" he asked again. "Yes, sir. Brooks. Not Carter anymore." Of course not, he thought. 18 years was enough time for a person to build an entirely new life. Annie glanced between Edward and the bracelet. "You know her?" Edward hesitated. "I knew someone named Marissa," he said carefully. "A long time ago." Frank rubbed his chin. "Well, whoever she is, she sold the bracelet fair and square," he said. "And like I told the kid, somebody else already asked about it today." Annie's shoulders tightened. Edward looked at the pawn shop owner. How serious was the buyer? Frank shrugged. Sounded interested. Said he collects vintage pieces. Might stop by before closing. He nodded toward the bracelet in Edward's hand. "So if nobody here can buy it, I'll probably sell it tonight." Annie looked as if someone had pulled the air out of the room. "But that's my mama's," she whispered. "Frank Seahill, kid, in this place, everything used to belong to somebody." Annie stared at the bracelet again. Edward turned the bracelet slowly between his fingers. "You said your mother sold it because of rent?" he asked Annie. She nodded. "She lost her job last month." "What kind of job?" "She worked nights at a nursing home." Frank nodded. "That's right. She mentioned that when she came in." Annie looked up again. "She said it was only temporary." The girl added quietly. "But the rent still came." "What happened when she sold it?" Edward asked. Annie nodded slowly. "She keeps touching her wrist now," Annie said. "Like it's still there." Edward felt the memory hit him like a sudden gust of cold wind. Marissa laughing under a streetlight. Marissa holding her wrist up, admiring the bracelet the night he had given it to her. Marissa saying she would never take it off. He swallowed. "What did she tell you about the bracelet?" he asked. Annie looked down at the glass counter. "She said someone gave it to her when the world still believed in her." Frank let out a soft whistle. "Well," he muttered. "That's one way to remember a man." Edward didn't react. Instead, he looked at Annie again. "You came here to buy it back yourself?" "Yes, sir." "With this?" he asked, gesturing toward the coins and the $50 bill. Annie nodded. "I counted it 3 times. Edward studied the small pile of money. $87 and change. The entire fortune of a 6-year-old girl. "Kid," he said gently, "that bracelet costs $800. I know. You're not even close." "I know." Edward paused. "Then why did you come?" Annie lifted her head. "Because if nobody tries, then it's really gone." If this moment touched your heart, please like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from because we love seeing how far these stories reach. And if you enjoy powerful stories about courage, kindness, and second chances, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. Frank leaned against the counter again. Can't argue with that logic. Edward looked down at the bracelet once more. The gold links caught the fluorescent light in soft reflections. 18 years. He had not seen Marissa in 18 years. Not since the day ambition and fear had convinced him that love was something a man could postpone until later. Later, he had learned, rarely arrived. Edward took a slow breath. "Frank," he said. "Yeah? How much did you loan her for it?" Frank scratched his chin. $300. "And the buyback price?" $800 with the interest and holding time. Edward nodded once. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat. Frank noticed immediately. "Well now," the pawn shop owner said carefully. "Looks like we're getting somewhere." Edward pulled out his wallet. Annie watched the movement with wide eyes. "You're buying it?" she asked quietly. Edward looked down at her. "I'm buying it back." Annie's face lit up with hope. "Really?" He didn't answer her yet. Instead, he turned to Frank. "I'll pay the buyback price." Frank straightened slightly. "You sure?" Edward placed several crisp bills on the counter. "I'm sure." Frank counted quickly. $800. He slid the bracelet's small box across the counter. "Well," the old man said. "Looks like the bracelet's going home." Edward picked it up. The weight of it felt different now. Annie stared at the box as if it contained something magical. "You did it," she whispered. Edward closed the lid gently. "No," he said quietly. "You did." Annie blinked. "I did?" "You came here," he said. "You asked for help. That takes courage." The girl looked down at her coins again. "What about my money?" she asked. Edward gently pushed the $50 bill back toward her. "Keep it. But you might need it later." Annie hesitated before slowly taking it back. Then she looked up at him. Can we go give it to Mama now? Edward felt something tighten inside his chest again. Marisa. He stared at the bracelet box in his hand. For 18 years he had wondered what had happened to the woman he once believed he would marry. Now the answer was standing in front of him. Edward slipped the bracelet box carefully into his coat pocket. Yes, he said. I think we should. Annie smiled for the first time since he had met her. A small, hopeful smile. Edward turned toward the door of the pawn shop. The late afternoon light spilled through the window. Somewhere in Chicago, Marissa Brooks was sitting in a small apartment, probably believing the last beautiful thing from her past had just disappeared forever. Edward opened the door. Come on, Annie, he said quietly. We're going to surprise your mother. Edward Hale stepped out of the pawn shop with the small box containing the bracelet tucked carefully inside his coat pocket. The late afternoon air in Chicago had turned cooler while they were inside. A wind moved along the street, pushing dry leaves across the sidewalk in slow scraping circles. Behind him, Frank Rivers locked the shop door and flipped the sign to close it early. The old pawn shop owner watched the pair for a moment through the window, then shook his head with a faint smile before disappearing back into the shop. Edward glanced down. Annie stood beside him quietly, her hands wrapped around the little cloth pouch of coins. For the first time since they met, the tension in her shoulders seemed lighter. You really bought it, she said. Edward nodded once. Yes. Annie looked toward the street as if trying to imagine how the moment would look when her mother saw the bracelet again. She's going to be surprised, Annie said. Edward gave a faint smile. I think you're right. They began walking down the block together. Traffic moved slowly along the avenue, and the sky above the buildings was turning the pale orange color that meant evening was not far away. After a few steps, Annie looked up at him. Do you know my mama well? She asked. Edward kept his eyes forward for a moment before answering. I knew her a long time ago. How long? Me. Before you were born. Annie nodded thoughtfully, as if that explained more than it probably did. My mama doesn't talk about the past much, she said. That doesn't surprise me. Annie tilted her head. Why? Edward considered the question. Sometimes people keep certain memories quiet, he said slowly, because those memories matter too much. Annie accepted that explanation without argument. They walked another half block before she spoke again. When she sold the bracelet, Annie said, she told me something. What was that? She said some things aren't just jewelry. They're proof that someone once believed in you. Edward felt the words settle deep in his chest. Yes, he said quietly. That sounds like something she would say. They reached the corner and waited for the pedestrian light to change. Cars rolled past in steady lines, their headlights beginning to flicker on as dusk crept across the city. Annie studied Edward carefully. You didn't tell me your name, she said. He looked down at her. Edward. Just Edward? He almost laughed. Just Edward is fine. Annie nodded. My name's Annie, she said again, as if making sure the introduction was complete. I remember. The crosswalk signal flashed white. They crossed the street together. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. Edward's thoughts drifted somewhere far behind him. Back through years he had tried not to revisit. Marissa standing outside a campus bookstore, arguing with him about which novel was the greatest American story ever written. Marissa sitting across from him in a diner booth at midnight, laughing so loudly the waitress had told them to quiet down. Marissa holding her wrist up under a streetlight the night he had given her the bracelet. You know, Annie said suddenly, interrupting his thoughts. Mama almost didn't sell it. Edward looked down at her. She didn't? Annie shook her head. She held it for a long time. Then she said something like, memories don't pay rent. Edward let out a slow breath. That sounds like a difficult choice. She didn't want me to see, Annie said. But I did. They turned onto a quieter street lined with small apartment buildings. Edward noticed the way Annie walked with calm certainty. She clearly knew the neighborhood well. Your mother must worry about you, he said. She does, Annie replied. But she also says people are stronger than they think. Edward smiled slightly. That also sounds like her. Annie glanced at him again. You talk like you miss her. Edward didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched the windows of the buildings as they passed, each one glowing with different shades of evening life. Television, light, kitchen lamps, silhouettes moving behind curtains. Yes, he said at last. I suppose I do. They walked another half block before Annie stopped suddenly. That one, she said, pointing. A modest 3-story brick building stood on the corner. The paint around the entrance door had begun to peel, and the mailbox panel beside it was slightly crooked, but the windows were clean, and a small potted plant sat on the second-floor ledge. That's where we live, Annie said. Edward looked up at the building. For reasons he could not fully explain, his heartbeat began to quicken. 18 years. 18 years since he had last seen Marissa. He slipped a hand into his coat pocket and felt the small bracelet box resting there. So, Annie said, studying him again. Are you nervous? Edward let out a quiet breath. Maybe a little. Annie considered that. Don't worry, she said calmly. Mama's nice. Edward couldn't help smiling at that. I remember. They walked up the short path to the building entrance. Just before Annie reached for the door handle, Edward spoke. Annie. She turned back. Yes? He looked at her carefully. When we go upstairs, he said, your mother might be surprised to see me. That's the point, Annie replied matter-of-factly. Edward nodded. Yes, he said softly. I suppose it is. Annie pushed the door open. Warm air from the hallway drifted outside. Edward followed her in, his pulse beating steadily in his chest. Somewhere above them, in one of those small apartments, Marissa Brooks was waiting without knowing it, and after 18 years, Edward Hale was about to see her again. Annie climbed the stairs with the calm confidence of someone who had walked them 1,000 times. Edward followed a step behind her, his hand still resting inside the pocket of his coat where the small bracelet box lay. Each step up the narrow staircase felt heavier than the one before it. The hallway smelled faintly of laundry detergent and cooking rice. Second floor. Annie stopped in front of apartment 2B. She turned back to him. You ready? She asked. Edward let out a quiet breath. I'm not sure. Annie seemed to think about that for a second. Mama says sometimes the right thing feels scary before it feels good. Edward nodded slowly. That sounds like her. Annie knocked twice. Inside the apartment, footsteps moved across the floor. Edward felt his heart begin to pound harder than it had in years. The door opened. Marissa Brooks stood there. For a moment, none of them spoke. Marissa looked exactly as Edward remembered her and completely different at the same time. Her hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands falling across her forehead. She wore a simple gray sweater and dark jeans, and there was a tiredness in her eyes that hadn't been there 18 years ago. But the expression in those eyes, the quiet strength, the way she held herself, none of that had changed. Her gaze moved first to Annie. Annie, she said, surprised. I thought you were in your room. Then she noticed Edward. Everything in her expression froze. Edward saw the exact moment she recognized him. Her eyes widened slightly. Edward? His name left her lips like something she had not expected to say again in this lifetime. Yes, he said quietly. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Annie looked between them. You know each other, she said with obvious satisfaction. Marissa's attention snapped back to her daughter. Annie, where have you been? She asked, her voice gentle but firm. I turned around and you weren't in the apartment. I went to the pawn shop, Annie said simply. Marissa blinked. You what? Edward saw the realization spread across her face like a slow wave. The bracelet, Marissa whispered. Annie nodded. I didn't want it to be gone. Marissa looked down at her daughter with a mixture of disbelief and tenderness. You shouldn't have gone out by yourself. I wasn't alone, Annie said quickly. Edward helped. Marissa's eyes lifted to him again. Edward slowly reached into his coat pocket. I think this belongs to you, he said. He placed the small box into her hand. Marissa stared at it without opening it. Her fingers trembled slightly. Edward, you didn't have to open it, Annie said. Marissa hesitated before lifting the lid. The gold bracelet rested inside. For a moment, she simply stared at it. Edward watched her carefully. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the kitchen. Marissa touched the bracelet gently. Then she closed her eyes. I thought it was gone, she said quietly. Annie smiled. I told you we'd get it back. Marissa knelt down and wrapped her arms around her daughter. You're something else. You know that? She said softly. Annie leaned into the hug but looked over her mother's shoulder at Edward with a proud expression. Edward felt something warm and painful at the same time settle in his chest. After a moment, Marissa stood again, still holding the bracelet. You bought it? She asked him. Yes. You shouldn't have. Edward shrugged slightly. It seemed important. Marissa looked down at the bracelet again. I didn't sell it because I wanted to, she said quietly. I know. She looked up at him, surprised. You know? Edward nodded once. I heard the story. Marissa exhaled slowly. Annie watched both of them carefully, sensing the strange weight in the room even if she didn't understand it. You two look like people in a movie when they see each other after a long time, Annie said. Edward almost laughed. Marissa shook her head slightly. It has been a long time. 18 years, Edward said. Marissa raised her eyebrows. You kept count. I tried not to. She studied him for a moment. You look successful. Edward glanced around the small apartment. I look like someone who made different choices. Marissa didn't reply immediately. Instead, she slipped the bracelet around her wrist again. The clasp clicked softly into place. For the first time since Edward had arrived, a genuine smile touched her face. Annie noticed immediately. See? She said proudly. You smile different. Marissa brushed a hand through Annie's hair. You really did all this? Annie nodded. And Edward helped. Marissa turned toward him again. Thank you. Edward shook his head. You should thank her. Marissa looked down at Annie. I always do. The evening light coming through the window softened the room. Edward suddenly realized something. Annie had her mother's eyes. The same shape, the same steady way of looking at the world. Marissa noticed the direction of his gaze. What? She asked quietly. Edward hesitated. Then he said something he had not planned to say. Annie reminds me of someone I used to know. Marissa held his gaze for a long moment. I'm sure she does. Annie looked between them again. You two talk like there's a big story, she said. Marissa sighed softly. There is. Can I hear it? Marissa smiled. Maybe someday. Edward looked at the bracelet on her wrist again. Some stories take time to tell, he said. Annie nodded thoughtfully. That's okay, she said. We have time. Edward wasn't so sure. But for the first time in 18 years, the possibility didn't feel impossible anymore. Marissa set a kettle on the small kitchen stove while Annie pulled 2 chairs toward the narrow table by the window. The apartment was modest, but it was tidy in the careful way of people who respected the things they had because there were not many of them. A soft lamp glowed near the couch. A stack of library books sat beside it. Edward remained standing near the doorway for a moment, taking in the room quietly. Nothing about the place was extravagant. A worn rug, a small wooden table with 3 mismatched chairs, a refrigerator covered with magnets and drawings that Annie had clearly made herself. But there was something else in the room too. Warmth. Marissa noticed him standing there. You don't have to stay by the door, she said gently. You're not a stranger. Edward gave a small smile. I'm not sure that's entirely true. Sit, she said, pulling out a chair. He obeyed. Annie climbed into the chair across from him and rested her chin in her hands like a detective studying a mystery. So, she said, you two knew each other before I was born. Marissa poured hot water into 3 cups. Yes. How? Marissa glanced at Edward. That's a long story. Annie's eyes brightened. Those are the best kind. Edward leaned back slightly in the chair. You always liked stories? He asked her. Annie nodded proudly. Mama says every person is a walking story. Marissa handed Edward a mug. I still say that. The warmth of the tea seeped through the ceramic cup into his hands. Edward hadn't realized how cold his fingers had been until that moment. For a few seconds they sat quietly. Finally, Marissa spoke again. I didn't expect to see you again, she said. Edward nodded slowly. Neither did I. Annie looked between them. Was it a bad goodbye? Marissa smiled faintly. No. Just an unfinished one. Edward looked down at the bracelet on her wrist. The gold links caught the lamplight softly. You kept it all these years, he said. Marissa followed his gaze. Yes. Why? She gave a small shrug. Because it reminded me that once someone believed I deserved beautiful things. Edward felt that sentence land in his chest like a quiet weight. Annie watched them both. You still believe that? She said matter-of-factly. Marissa smiled at her daughter. Sometimes children see things more clearly than adults. Edward nodded. That's definitely true. Annie leaned closer. So, tell me something, she said. When you gave Mama the bracelet, were you already rich? Edward laughed softly. No. How rich were you? I owned a car that only started on the 2nd try. Annie considered that. That's not rich. No. He agreed. Marissa chuckled. He used to claim the car had personality. Edward shook his head. It did. You named it. Everyone names their car when it breaks down every week. Annie giggled. The sound filled the small apartment in a way that made the room feel lighter. Marissa looked at Edward again. You really didn't have to buy the bracelet. Edward shrugged slightly. Maybe not. $800 is a lot for something that technically already belonged to me once. Edward glanced toward Annie. Your daughter convinced me. Annie straightened proudly. I did? Yes. How? Edward leaned forward slightly. You reminded me that some things are worth fixing even if they're old mistakes. Marissa's eyes softened. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Annie tilted her head. Edward? Yes? You look like someone who thinks a lot. That's because I do. What are you thinking now? Edward paused. I'm thinking about how strange life can be. Annie waited. Sometimes, he continued, you spend years running forward, building things, chasing goals. And then one day you open a door and the past is standing there waiting for you. Annie nodded thoughtfully. That happened today. Yes, he said. Marissa studied him. You built quite a life, she said quietly. Edward shrugged again. I worked a lot. I noticed. How? Marissa smiled faintly. Your face has the same look it used to get during finals week. Edward laughed softly. I didn't realize that showed. It always did. Annie raised her hand like she was in school. I have a question. Edward pointed at her. Go ahead. Did you two break up because of something big? Marissa and Edward both froze. Marissa cleared her throat. That's a complicated question. Annie shrugged. I like complicated. Edward looked at Marissa. Do you want to answer that? She considered for a moment. Then she said quietly, sometimes two people care about each other, but the world around them pulls them in different directions. Annie thought about that. So nobody was the bad guy? Edward smiled sadly. Sometimes life doesn't need a villain to make things difficult. Annie seemed satisfied with that answer. She hopped down from the chair. I'm going to put the bracelet box in the drawer so we don't lose it again, she announced. Marissa watched her disappear into the bedroom. When the door closed, the apartment fell into a quieter silence. Edward and Marissa looked at each other across the small table. You're doing well, he said softly. I'm doing my best. He nodded. She's remarkable. Marissa smiled. She keeps me honest. Edward looked toward the hallway where Annie had gone. Then he asked something he had been wondering since the pawn shop. Marissa. Yes? Is Annie? He didn't finish the question. Marissa watched him carefully. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she took a slow breath. That, she said quietly, is part of the story Annie doesn't know yet. Edward sat very still. The kettle on the stove ticked softly as it cooled. Outside, a distant siren echoed through the evening streets. And for the first time in 18 years, Edward realized that the story he thought had ended might only have been paused. Annie came back from the bedroom carrying the empty bracelet box with both hands, as if it were something delicate and ceremonial. She slid it into the top drawer of the small cabinet beside the couch, then returned to the kitchen table with the satisfied expression of someone who had set an important thing in order. There, she said. Now it has a place. Marissa smiled at her daughter. Thank you. Edward watched the simple exchange in silence. A place. The words lingered with him longer than they should have. For years, his life had been full of addresses, offices, hotels, conference rooms, private cars, reserved tables, schedules so crowded they erased one day into the next. Yet, sitting in Marissa's small apartment, with its warm lamplight and worn rug and cabinet drawer that now held a little empty bracelet box, he understood something he had not let himself feel in a very long time. This was what a place looked like when people actually lived in it. Annie climbed back into her chair and reached for her tea. You didn't finish your question, she said. Looking at Edward, Marissa's eyes flicked toward him, a small warning in them now. Edward chose his next words carefully. No, he said. I suppose I didn't. Annie looked between them again with the steady interest she seemed to bring to every silence in the room. Adults do that a lot, she said. They stop talking right when it gets interesting. Marissa let out a small breath that almost passed for a laugh. That's because adults know some things require timing. Timing is just waiting with extra steps, Annie replied. Edward smiled despite himself. Marissa shook her head. Where do you get these lines? From listening. That, Edward said. I believe. For a moment, the conversation softened again. Marissa rose from her chair and moved to the stove, opening a small pan on low heat. The scent of tomato and garlic drifted gently through the apartment. I was reheating soup, she said without turning. It's not much, but you're welcome to stay for dinner. Edward was about to refuse out of habit. For years, refusal had come naturally to him. He declined meals, invitations, family events. Anything that required emotional presence he did not know how to sustain. But something in Marissa's tone stopped him. It was not obligation. It was not politeness. It was something quieter. A door, left open just enough. I'd like that, he said. Marissa nodded once, still facing the stove. Annie looked delighted. Good. Mama's soup is better when people eat it. It's canned tomato soup with grilled cheese, Marissa said. That's still better when people eat it, Annie replied. Edward leaned back in his chair, studying the apartment more openly now. There was a framed photograph on the far shelf of Marissa holding Annie on a beach, the lake behind them silver under summer light. Beside it sat a school certificate with Annie's name on it and 3 gold stars in the corner. On the refrigerator, tucked under a magnet shaped like Illinois, was a handwritten list in neat, dark ink. Call landlord, submit application, check library, hold, milk, rice, eggs, ordinary life, he thought. Not easy life, but ordinary life, the kind he had once wanted before he convinced himself ambition was more urgent. Marissa set bowls on the table and moved with the same graceful efficiency he remembered from long ago. She had always done small things with care, as if care itself were a form of dignity. Annie took the plates of grilled cheese and carried them one by one to the table. Careful, Marissa said. I know. Edward watched them work around each other without a wasted word. There was rhythm there, familiarity, the easy choreography built from years of making a life together inside narrow margins. He suddenly felt like a man standing outside a window he had once dreamed of entering. When they finally sat down, Annie folded her hands for a second. Can we say thank you first? Marissa gave her a soft smile. Of course. Annie bowed her head. Thank you for soup and sandwiches and for bringing the bracelet back, and for not letting today turn into a bad day. She lifted her head again. Amen. Edward looked down at his bowl, unexpectedly moved. Marissa broke her sandwich in half. She makes up her own prayers. They're honest, Annie said. That they are. They began to eat. For several minutes, only the sound of spoons and the faint scrape of plates filled the apartment. Edward had not realized how hungry he was until the first warm spoonful settled into him. This is good, he said. It's soup from a can, Marissa replied. It's still good, Annie nodded. I told you. The easy warmth of the table almost made the larger conversation forget itself. Almost. But not quite. Marissa must have felt it too. Halfway through dinner, she set her spoon down and looked across at Edward. You asked a question before Annie came back, she said. Edward met her gaze. I know. Annie looked up immediately. A good question? Marissa's expression softened and tightened at once. An important one. Annie sat a little straighter. Edward could feel his pulse in his throat now. Ridiculous for a man who had negotiated mergers worth hundreds of millions without breaking a sweat. But this was different. This was not risk on paper. This was risk in flesh and memory. He set down his spoon. Marissa, he said quietly, I don't want to push where I have no right to push. But I do need to ask. Annie's eyes moved from him to her mother. Marissa held his gaze, then looked down into her soup before answering. I always knew this moment might come, she said softly. Edward did not move. I just didn't think it would come through a pawn shop. Annie frowned. That sounds like a sad joke. Marissa smiled faintly. A little. Then she straightened in her chair and turned her attention fully to Edward. When I left, she said, I was already pregnant. The room went utterly still. Edward felt every part of him lock in place. He had imagined the possibility the moment he truly saw Annie, the shape of her eyes, the timing, the impossible pull he felt standing across from her. But imagination was one thing. Hearing the truth was another. Annie looked from one face to the other, sensing the shift even if she could not fully name it. Marissa continued, her voice calm, almost too calm. I tried to tell you. Edward's breath left him slowly. What? She nodded. Twice. He stared at her. I never got anything. I know that now, she said. At the time, I thought you had your reasons. A dull ache opened in his chest. What happened? Marissa leaned back slightly, as though she had carried this answer so long that speaking it aloud required her to set it down with care. I called your apartment, she said. Your roommate told me you'd moved out. I wrote a letter to your office internship in New York. It came back unopened. After that, she lifted one shoulder. Your mother's assistant called me and suggested, very politely, that I stop embarrassing the family. Edward shut his eyes for a moment. He could picture his mother's world with painful clarity. The smooth voices, the closed doors, the invisible machinery of exclusion dressed up as civility. When I didn't hear from you, Marissa said, I made the mistake of believing the silence was your answer. It wasn't, Edward said immediately. Her eyes found his again. I know that now too, but back then I had a child on the way and no room left in my life for maybe. Annie set her sandwich down. Are you talking about me? No one answered right away, not because they wanted to deceive her, but because the truth had entered the room too quickly for either adult to decide where its edges should stop. Marissa reached for Annie's hand. We're talking about the time before you were born. Annie accepted that for the moment, though her face made it clear she understood more than they hoped. Edward looked at Marissa, and when he spoke, his voice was lower than before. "You should have told me." The moment the words left him, he knew how unfair they sounded. Marissa heard it too. "I tried," she said. Not sharply, just truthfully. "And then I got tired of knocking on doors that stayed closed." He bowed his head. There it was. Not one betrayal, but a chain of them. Family, pride, silence, distance. The efficient cruelty of people who believed they were protecting his future, while rearranging other people's lives like inconvenient furniture. Annie watched him in silence for several long seconds. Then she asked the question neither adult was ready for. "Edward," she said, "are you my father?" The apartment seemed to shrink around the words. Marissa squeezed Annie's hand gently. Edward looked at the girl across the table, then at the woman he had once loved, and knew there was no clean way through what came next. Only honesty. Late, imperfect honesty. He opened his mouth, but Marissa spoke first. "That," she said softly, "is something we're going to talk about carefully." Annie nodded once, not satisfied but willing to wait. It was a mature kind of patience, and somehow that made the moment harder. Edward looked at her and saw it all at once. The years he had not known, the birthdays he had not attended, the scraped knees, the school mornings, the nights of soup and worry and library books and careful prayers. An entire life had unfolded without him, and he had not even known where to grieve it. "I would like," he said, choosing each word with care, "to talk about it the right way. With your mother, and with you. If that's all right." Annie studied him, then nodded slowly. "That sounds fair." Marissa looked at him for a long time after that. Not forgiving, not accusing, just seeing him, perhaps more clearly than she had in years. Outside, night settled fully over the street. Inside, 3 bowls sat on a small kitchen table under a warm light, and the truth at last had begun to take its seat among them. The apartment was quiet after Annie's question, not the comfortable quiet from earlier when they were eating dinner, but a deeper silence, the kind that arrives when truth finally steps into the room and no one is quite sure where to place it. Annie watched both adults carefully. Edward sat very still at the small kitchen table, his hands folded together as if he were holding something fragile between them. Across from him, Marissa had not let go of Annie's hand. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street. Its headlights slid across the apartment wall and disappeared. Finally, Annie spoke again. "You didn't answer." Her voice wasn't demanding. It was patient. Edward looked at Marissa first. She held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slightly. Not permission, but acknowledgement that the moment could not simply be avoided. Edward turned his attention back to Annie. "I didn't answer," he said quietly, "because questions like that deserve the truth, not something rushed." Annie seemed to accept that explanation, though her eyes remained steady. "Do you think you might be?" she asked. Edward breathed in slowly. "Yes," he said. The word hung in the air. Annie did not react dramatically. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and studied him in the same thoughtful way she had been studying the world since he met her in the pawn shop. "I wondered," she said. Marissa blinked in surprise. "You did?" Annie shrugged slightly. "Well, you two look at each other like people who already know the ending of the same story." Edward felt something tighten in his throat. "That's a very observant thing to say." Annie nodded. "I listen a lot." Marissa brushed her fingers gently through Annie's hair. "You've always been good at that." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Annie asked another question. "If you're my father," she said, "why didn't you come before?" Edward closed his eyes briefly. It was the question he had already asked himself a dozen times in the last 10 minutes. When he opened them again, he spoke honestly. "Because I didn't know." Annie looked at Marissa. Marissa nodded. "That part is true." Edward leaned forward slightly. "When your mother and I knew each other, we were young," he said. "And sometimes young people make decisions they don't understand until much later." Annie absorbed that quietly. "You mean mistakes?" "Yes," Edward said. "Big ones?" "Yes." Marissa's voice joined softly. "Some mistakes don't look like mistakes at first," she said. "Sometimes they look like opportunities." Edward gave a faint, rueful smile. "That's exactly right." Annie looked between them again. "But if you didn't know about me," she said slowly, "then how did you find us today?" Edward glanced toward the hallway where the bracelet box now rested inside the cabinet drawer. "You found me," he said. Annie tilted her head. I did? You walked into a pawn shop, Edward replied, and asked a stranger for help. She considered that. That was brave, he added. Annie shrugged modestly. I just didn't want Mama to lose the bracelet. Marissa looked down at the gold band resting on her wrist. I never expected to see it again. Edward's gaze followed hers. I didn't expect to see it either. The bracelet gleamed softly in the lamplight. For a moment, the three of them sat quietly again. Then Annie slid off her chair. I need to get something, she announced. Marissa looked up. What is it? My drawing. Before either adult could ask more, Annie disappeared into the bedroom. Edward watched the hallway thoughtfully. She's remarkable, he said. Marissa smiled faintly. She had to grow up with a mother who reads too many books and asks too many questions. Edward shook his head. No, he said quietly. She's remarkable because she's kind. Marissa looked at him. You noticed that? It's hard not to. She leaned back slightly in her chair. I raised her to pay attention to people, she said. The world has enough people who don't. Edward nodded slowly. I've met many of them. Marissa studied him for a moment. You're different than I expected. Edward raised an eyebrow. How so? I expected confidence. You're disappointed? Marissa shook her head gently. No. I see someone who has spent a long time thinking about what matters. Edward exhaled. That might be the most accurate description anyone's given me in years. Footsteps returned from the hallway. Annie walked back into the kitchen holding a sheet of paper. I found it, she said. She placed the drawing carefully on the table. Edward leaned forward. The drawing showed 3 stick figures holding hands. One tall woman with curly hair, one small girl with a wide smile, and one tall man standing beside them. Above the figures was a bright yellow sun and a house with a red roof. Annie pointed at each figure. That's Mama. Marissa smiled. And that's you. Yes. Annie then pointed to the third figure. And that one is the person who helps. Edward studied the drawing. The helper? He asked. Annie nodded. I didn't know who it would be yet, she explained. But Mama says sometimes people appear exactly when they're supposed to. Edward felt the quiet weight of that statement settle over him. Marissa looked at the drawing, then at him. She also says life has a strange sense of timing. Edward gave a small smile. It certainly does. Annie slid the paper closer to him. You can keep it, she said. Edward looked up. Are you sure? Yes, Annie replied. Because you helped bring the bracelet home. Edward carefully lifted the drawing. He had signed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He had been given awards, plaques, framed recognitions, but somehow this simple drawing felt heavier than all of them. Thank you, he said quietly. Annie seemed satisfied. Then she looked at the clock on the wall. Mama, she said, it's almost my reading time. Marissa nodded. You're right. Annie turned to Edward. Do you like stories? I do. Good, Annie said. Because if you're going to visit again, you should know we read every night. Edward looked at Marissa. She met his gaze calmly. You're welcome to come back, she said. Edward folded the drawing gently. I'd like that. Annie smiled. Then tomorrow you can hear the next chapter. Edward nodded. For the first time in many years, the idea of tomorrow felt like a beginning instead of a continuation. Edward did come back the next evening. He told himself on the drive over that he was only following through on a promise made at a kitchen table, only stepping into a conversation that had already begun. But as he sat at a red light 3 blocks from Marissa's apartment, he knew better. He had spent 18 years building a life so full it left no room for unfinished things. Meetings, flights, investors, deadlines, dinners where everyone knew his name and no one knew anything about him that mattered. He had become very good at movement, at momentum, at staying just ahead of memory. Yet now, for the first time in years, he had driven somewhere with no briefcase, no assistant, no prepared explanation for why he was there, only a paper bag from a neighborhood bakery on the passenger seat beside him. By the time he climbed the stairs to apartment 2B, he could smell dinner through the hallway. Garlic, butter, and something baked. A soft yellow light glowed beneath the door. He knocked. Annie opened it almost immediately. You came, she said, as if she had expected nothing less. Edward held up the bakery bag. I thought I should bring something. Annie peered inside. Cookies? Chocolate chip. She stepped aside at once. That was the correct choice. Edward smiled and entered. The apartment felt different in the evening. Warmer. More lived in. A low jazz station played from the kitchen radio. The lamp by the couch was on again, and a pot simmered on the stove while Marissa stood at the counter slicing cornbread. She looked over her shoulder when he came in. For half a second, her expression softened in a way that caught him off guard. Then it settled into something gentler, steadier. "You found us twice," she said. "I'm hoping that means I'm improving." Annie took the bag from him and walked it to the table with quiet ceremony. He brought peace offerings. Marissa almost laughed. "Is that what they are?" "That depends," Edward said. "Am I being judged?" "Constantly," Marissa replied. The old ease between them surfaced in flashes like that brief, unexpected, almost dangerous in the way familiar things could be after a long absence. It did not erase the years between them. It simply reminded him that the years had not erased everything. Dinner was simple. Baked chicken, green beans, cornbread, and sweet tea in mismatched glasses. Annie told him she had gotten full marks on a spelling worksheet, and that Mrs. Ruiz in the building next door had once owned a parrot that insulted delivery drivers. Marissa corrected details where needed, and Edward found himself listening less for information than for rhythm. This, he thought, was what he had missed without even knowing the shape of it. Not only birthdays and school events and scraped knees. Smaller things, the daily music of a home, the jokes that did not need setup, the repeated stories that got better because they were repeated. After dinner, Annie carried her plate to the sink and announced, "Now we read." Marissa dried her hands on a dish towel. "We do." Annie turned to Edward. "You said you like stories." "I do." "Good. Tonight is chapter 8. Edward frowned slightly. "Chapter 8? Of what?" "My book." She disappeared into the bedroom and came back with a paperback copy of Charlotte's Web that had been taped along the spine. She handed it to him as if assigning an important responsibility. "You can read tonight," she said. Edward took the book carefully. "That's a lot of pressure." "No," Annie said. "Pressure is when Mama lets me crack eggs." Marissa leaned against the doorframe, watching them both. Edward sat on the couch, and Annie settled beside him with a blanket over her legs. Marissa took the armchair across from them. For a moment he simply looked at the page without reading. Not because the words were difficult, but because the scene itself felt impossible in a way success never had. Then he began. His voice was a little stiff at first. Annie noticed but said nothing. By the second page, he found the rhythm. By the third, he had forgotten to be self-conscious. Annie listened with complete attention, interrupting only once to say Wilbur worried too much and that some friendships began because one person had the courage to speak first. Edward glanced at Marissa after that line. She met his gaze for a beat too long. When the chapter ended, Annie stretched and closed the book with both hands. "You read better than I expected." Edward put a hand to his chest. "I'm choosing to hear that as a compliment." "It is." Marissa stood. "Brush your teeth." "I already did." "Then prove it." Annie grinned and went to the bathroom. When the door closed, the room changed. Not sharply, just enough. Marissa gathered the empty tea glasses from the side table. Edward stood to help, but she shook her head once and motioned him toward the kitchen anyway. "You can carry those," she said. He took the glasses. At the sink, they moved around each other with caution first. Then, with an old physical memory they had no right to still possess. She rinsed plates. He dried them. Neither looked directly at the other for the first minute. Finally, Marissa spoke. "She likes you." Edward set down a plate a little too carefully. "I like her too. That's not what I meant." He nodded. "I know." The faucet ran for a moment. "She doesn't trust easily," Marissa said. "Not with men." Edward looked at her then. "Why?" Marissa turned the water off. "Because children notice absence, even when you don't explain it." The sentence was calm, but it landed with force. He lowered his eyes. "I would have come." Marissa set both hands on the edge of the sink. "I know you believe that. It's not belief, it's truth." She let out a slow breath. "Edward, I'm not trying to punish you. I'm too tired for punishment and too old for drama. But truth has timing too, and ours came late." He leaned one shoulder against the counter. "Do you hate me?" She looked at him then, fully. "No," she said. "That would have been easier." He almost smiled, but did not. "What do you feel?" Marissa dried her hands and folded the towel neatly before answering. "Sometimes I feel angry. Sometimes relieved. Sometimes foolish for still recognizing your face before your voice." She paused. "And sometimes I feel like the worst thing that happened wasn't that you left. It was that I had to make peace with not knowing whether you left on purpose." Edward swallowed hard. "I didn't. I know that now. But knowing now doesn't give you back the years." "No," she said. It doesn't. They stood there in the quiet kitchen, while the jazz station hummed softly from the radio. Somewhere down the hall, a pipe knocked once inside the wall. Edward spoke more carefully than before. What does Annie know? Marissa looked toward the bathroom. That her father isn't in the picture. That I loved him once. That life got complicated. I never wanted to build her childhood out of bitterness. She asked if I was her father. She asks direct questions. She gets that from you. No, Marissa said. She gets it from the space where answers should have been. He had no defense against that. Annie came back in her pajamas with a toothbrush still in hand. Are you having a serious talk without me? Marissa raised an eyebrow. You are not done. Annie disappeared again. Edward let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Marissa looked at him more gently now. She doesn't need everything at once. I know. She needs steadiness. He nodded. I can do that. Can you? The question was not cruel. That made it harder. Edward answered honestly. I don't know yet. But I know I want to try. Marissa studied him in silence. Not the man he had been at 22. Not the one from magazine covers or charity galas or glass offices high above the city. Just him, standing in her kitchen with a dish towel in his hand, and more regret than he had words for. At last she said, trying is not the same as staying. I know. Annie returned a third time, triumphant. Done. Marissa touched her shoulder. Good. Annie looked from one adult to the other, sensing the shift again. Did I miss the sad part? Edward answered before Marissa could. We were just talking about how some stories need more than one chapter. Annie seemed satisfied with that. That's true. She climbed onto the couch and tucked the blanket around herself again. You can stay a little longer if you want, she told Edward. Mama likes company more than she admits. Marissa gave her a look. Annie pretended not to notice. Edward sat back down on the couch. Then I'll stay a little longer. And when Annie, sleepy now, leaned against the cushion near him and began talking about a school project involving a paper sunflower, Edward realized the decision forming in him was no longer abstract. He did not only want answers, he wanted presence. Not one dramatic gesture. Not money. Not rescue after the fact. Presence, the kind that arrived on ordinary evenings with cookies from a bakery and stayed long enough to read chapter 8. When he finally rose to leave an hour later, Annie walked him to the door. Are you coming back tomorrow? She asked. Edward looked up at Marissa, who stood a few steps behind her in the hallway light. Then back at Annie. If your mother says it's all right. Annie turned immediately. Mama? Marissa held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once. Yes, she said. Annie smiled. Then tomorrow. Edward stepped into the hallway carrying nothing except his coat and the folded drawing Annie had given him the night before, now tucked safely inside his wallet. Tomorrow, he thought. For the first time in years, it did not feel like a date on a calendar. It felt like a chance. Edward did not sleep much that night. He returned to his apartment downtown long after the city lights had settled into their quiet rhythm. The building lobby greeted him with its usual marble floors, soft lighting, and polite nods from the night concierge. Everything there was polished, controlled, predictable, but none of it followed him upstairs. Instead, the small apartment on South Side Chicago stayed in his mind the warm light in Marissa's kitchen, the sound of Annie's voice reading along with him, the bracelet glinting on Marissa's wrist again after nearly disappearing from her life. Edward loosened his tie and set it on the counter. He reached into his wallet. The drawing Annie had given him slid out. 3 stick figures holding hands, a tall woman, a small girl, and a third figure labeled in careful pencil letters, the helper. Edward sat down slowly. For most of his life, he had been called many things. Founder, investor, executive, strategist. Newspapers liked words like visionary and billionaire, but never that one, helper. The simplicity of it unsettled him more than any headline ever had. He placed the drawing on the kitchen island and stared at it for a long time. Then he did something he had not done in years. He turned off his phone. No messages, no calendar alerts, no late-night investor questions, just silence and memory. Marissa laughing in a diner booth when they were 20. Marissa rolling her eyes at his terrible driving. Marissa holding out her wrist the night he had given her the bracelet. And now Marissa standing in a modest kitchen 18 years later, steady and tired, and still somehow stronger than the world had been fair to her. Edward leaned back in the chair. I missed everything, he said quietly to the empty apartment. The words felt heavy, but not hopeless, because Annie had said something earlier that evening. Sometimes people appear exactly when they're supposed to. He had dismissed it at first as the kind of optimistic philosophy children invented. Now he wasn't so sure. Across the city, in the small brick building where Marissa lived, Annie was also still awake. Her bedroom lamp glowed softly beside the bed while she lay under a blanket reading the last page of Charlotte's Web again. Marissa leaned in the doorway. "You should be asleep." "I will be. That's what you said 20 minutes ago." Annie closed the book slowly. "Mama?" "Yes?" "Edward is my father, isn't he?" Marissa did not answer immediately. Instead, she walked into the room and sat on the edge of the bed. Annie watched her calmly. "You always say questions deserve honest answers," Annie added. Marissa nodded. "I do." "So?" Marissa brushed a hand gently through Annie's hair. "Yes," she said quietly. Annie absorbed the answer with surprising calm. "I thought so." "You did?" You both look at each other like people who remember the same music. Marissa smiled faintly. "That's a poetic way of saying it. Is that why you never told him about me?" Marissa took a slow breath. "I tried," she said. "What happened?" "He didn't get the message." Annie considered that. "So nobody was trying to be mean?" "No. Just life being messy?" Marissa nodded. "That's a good way to describe it." Annie looked at the ceiling. "Are you mad at him?" Marissa thought for a moment. "No. Are you happy he came back?" That question took longer. "Yes," Marissa admitted. Annie smiled at that. "Good." Marissa raised an eyebrow. "That's all you're going to say?" Annie nodded. "Well, also that he reads better than Mrs. Alvarez." Marissa laughed softly. "That's quite a review." Annie rolled onto her side. "Is he going to come again tomorrow?" "Yes." "Good." Annie pulled the blanket up to her chin. "Mama?" "Yes?" "You're smiling again." Marissa hadn't noticed. Her hand drifted unconsciously to the bracelet around her wrist. The gold links felt familiar again. Comforting. "I suppose I am," she said. Across the city, Edward stood by his apartment window looking down at the lights of Chicago. For 18 years he had believed his life had followed a straight path forward. Now he realized something else entirely. The path had curved, and somehow it had brought him back to the one place he never expected to return. Not a boardroom, not a deal, not success. A small apartment, a bracelet, a child reading bedtime stories, and a woman who once knew him before the world changed him. Edward folded Annie's drawing carefully and placed it back in his wallet. Then he picked up his phone again, not to check messages, not to answer emails. Instead, he opened his calendar. For the first time in many years, he began deleting things. Meetings, dinners, trips, one by one. He cleared the next evening entirely, then the one after that, because for the first time in his life, something more important had appeared. And it wasn't a business opportunity. It was time. Time to learn the story he had missed. Time to decide whether the word Annie had written under the stick figure helper was just a child's drawing, or the beginning of the man he might still become. The next evening arrived with a light rain that turned the Chicago sidewalks dark and glossy under the street lamps. Edward parked a block away and walked the rest of the distance with his coat collar turned up against the damp wind. In his left hand, he carried a paper sack from a grocery store. Fresh bread, strawberries, a small carton of milk, and a box of tea Marissa had once loved in college and probably had not bought for herself in years. He almost laughed at himself climbing the stairs to apartment 2B. A man who had negotiated billion-dollar deals was suddenly nervous about bringing groceries to a woman he had not seen in 18 years. When Annie opened the door, she looked at the bag first. "You brought practical things," she said. Edward stepped inside. "Is that good or bad?" "It means you've been thinking." Marissa's voice came from the kitchen. "Annie, let him come all the way in before you inspect his intentions." Edward rounded the corner and saw Marissa at the counter slicing apples. She wore a soft blue sweater tonight, and the bracelet rested at her wrist as naturally as if it had never left. The sight of it still caught him off guard. "I wasn't sure what to bring," he said, setting the groceries on the table. Marissa glanced into the bag. "Tea, you used to like it." She paused, just briefly. "You remember that?" "I remember a lot more than I should." Annie took the strawberries out and inspected them with approval. "These are expensive strawberries." Edward raised an eyebrow. "You can tell? We only buy them when they're on sale." Marissa gave her daughter a look, but not an unhappy one. Edward felt, once again, the blunt force of the life he had missed, not as an abstract tragedy, but in these tiny practical truths. Sale strawberries, saved tea, soup from a can turned into dinner with care. He had lived so long in a world where price existed only as a number that he had forgotten how often it shaped a person's choices before the day even began. "You didn't have to bring anything," Marissa said. though her voice was softer than the first time she had said it. I know. Annie closed the refrigerator door and turned back to them. Good. Because it's better that you did it anyway. They ate in the same small kitchen, this time with roast chicken sandwiches, apple slices, and tea. The rain tapped lightly at the window while the radio played low in the background. Annie talked about a classmate who had insisted bats were birds and the unfairness of adults getting to decide bedtime, even when they were obviously less tired than children. Edward listened, laughed where he should, and answered every question Annie threw at him. But underneath the easy rhythm of the meal, something else moved steadily toward them. He could feel it in the pauses Marissa left hanging a little longer than usual. In the way her eyes sometimes rested on Annie, then shifted quietly to him. After dinner, Annie took her book to the couch, then surprised both adults by not opening it right away. I have a question before reading time, she said. Edward set down his cup. All right. Annie looked at him directly. Are you going to disappear? Marissa drew in a slow breath but said nothing. Edward did not answer quickly. He knew better now than to rush where honesty was required. No, he said at last. Annie held his gaze. You mean tonight, or for real? For real. She seemed to measure his face for any sign of adult vagueness. You can't promise things just because people want to hear them, she said. Marissa closed her eyes for half a second. Perhaps because the sentence was too wise. Perhaps because it was too earned. Edward nodded. You're right. Annie waited. So let me say it the right way, he continued. I'm not planning to disappear. I want to be here. And if I ever need to be away, I'll tell you the truth. Annie considered that carefully. That's better. Then she opened her book. Okay. Chapter 9. Edward took the paperback from her. But tonight he found the words harder to focus on. Not because of the story, but because Annie's question had settled inside him and started rearranging things. Are you going to disappear? In his world, men disappeared all the time without physically leaving. Into work, into ambition, into fear, into the version of themselves that looked strongest from a distance and weakest up close. When he finished the chapter, Annie yawned, stretched, and announced she would brush her teeth without being told because sometimes maturity should be recognized. Then she disappeared down the hall. Edward closed the book and set it gently on the coffee table. Marissa sat across from him in the armchair, her hands folded loosely in her lap. She meant that question, she said. I know. She's calm, but she notices everything. I know that too. Rain traced narrow lines down the window behind her. The room felt smaller in the evening, more intimate, as if every word spoken there had less room to escape. Edward leaned forward slightly. Marissa, I need to ask you something. All right. What do you want from me? She looked at him for a long moment, almost sadly. That's a very Edward question. He gave a faint, humorless smile. Meaning? Meaning you still think in terms of solutions, deliverables, outcomes. She tilted her head. Life doesn't always work that way. Then answer it however you want. Marissa let out a quiet breath. I want steadiness. For Annie. She paused. And I want honesty. For myself. He nodded slowly. I can give you honesty. Can you give her steadiness? The question landed harder than it should have, perhaps because he knew it was fair. He looked down at his hands. I'm trying to build my life around the possibility that I can. Marissa's expression changed at that. Not softened exactly, but something in it listened more closely. Build your life around it, she repeated. I started clearing my calendar. She almost smiled. That must have frightened half of downtown. It probably did. And why did you do that? Edward looked at her. The truth came easier now than it had the first night. Because I realized my life was full of things I chose, he said. And somehow I still missed the most important thing I never even knew I had. Marissa's gaze dropped to the bracelet on her wrist. Her thumb brushed the gold lightly. Edward, he went on before he lost his nerve. I can't ask you to forgive 18 years and 3 evenings, he said. I know that, and I can't walk in here acting like I get to claim a place I didn't earn. But I am asking you not to shut the door before I have a chance to prove I mean this. The apartment was very still. When Marissa finally spoke, her voice was low and steady. You know what the hardest part was? He shook his head, not raising Annie alone. She gave a small, tired smile. That was hard, yes, but not the hardest. The hardest part was teaching myself not to hate the unanswered question, not to build my life around why you never came. Edward felt the words like a bruise pressed from the inside. I'm sorry. I know. No, he said quietly. I don't think you do. She looked at him then, fully. I'm sorry for every year you had to carry that silence and make meaning out of it by yourself. I'm sorry you had to become stronger because people around me thought they knew what my future should look like. And I'm sorry that by the time truth got to us, it came dressed up like a pawn shop and a child who had to be brave. Marissa stared at him without speaking. For one unguarded second, her eyes shone. Not with collapse, not with fragility, just with the strain of being seen accurately after too many years of carrying her own story alone. Then Annie padded back into the room in socks and pajamas. Why does this room feel like a speech happened? Marissa let out a soft breath that might have become a laugh. Edward stood and held out a hand. Walk with me to the kitchen, detective. I need help deciding whether the strawberries should be washed tonight or tomorrow. Annie narrowed her eyes suspiciously. That sounds like distraction. It is. Okay. She took his hand. Marissa watched them go to the sink together, watched Annie solemnly explain the correct way to wash berries, without bruising their feelings. Watched Edward listen as if the instructions mattered, and perhaps, in their small way, they did, because that was the turning point, though none of them named it yet. Not the bracelet, not the revelation, not even the apology. It was this. A child asking whether he would disappear, and a man beginning, finally, to understand that love was not proved in grand gestures. It was proved in showing up again tomorrow. And the day after that, and after that, when the strawberries were dried and returned to the refrigerator, Annie declared the evening officially complete. At the door, as Edward put on his coat, she looked up at him and said, "You were less nervous tonight." He smiled. Was it obvious? Yes. Is that good? It means you're starting to belong. He glanced at Marissa. She stood a few feet behind Annie, one hand resting lightly against the doorframe. Their eyes met. Not a promise, not forgiveness, but something close to permission. The rain had stopped by the next morning. Chicago woke under a pale gray sky that made the city look freshly washed, as if the night had quietly rinsed away the dust and noise of the previous day. Traffic moved slowly along the avenues. Commuters carried coffee cups through the chill air, and the world continued its ordinary rhythm. But for Edward Hale, the morning felt different. He stood in his kitchen holding a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. On the counter beside him lay Annie's drawing. The three stick figures still held hands beneath a bright yellow sun. Edward had looked at it 3 times since waking. Each time it seemed less like a child's imagination and more like a quiet expectation. He glanced at the clock. 22:80 a.m. Annie would be getting ready for school. Without thinking about it too long, Edward grabbed his coat, folded the drawing back into his wallet, and left the apartment. 40 minutes later, he stood outside the small brick building again. This time, the street looked different in daylight. A school bus waited at the corner. A few neighbors moved in and out of the entrance carrying grocery bags or backpacks. Edward hesitated for half a second before knocking on apartment 2B. Inside, footsteps moved quickly. The door opened. Annie stood there wearing a blue jacket and holding a backpack nearly as big as she was. "You're early," she said. Edward raised an eyebrow. "You're observant." Annie stepped aside to let him in. Marissa appeared from the kitchen tying her hair back. "Edward, I was already out," he said, which was only partly true. Annie zipped her backpack and looked between them. "Perfect timing," she announced. "For what?" Edward asked. "For walking me to school." Marissa blinked. "You usually walk with Mrs. Ruiz." Annie shrugged. "Mrs. Ruiz left early today." Marissa looked at Edward. He understood the silent question immediately. "Are you ready for that?" Edward nodded slightly. "I'd like to." Marissa studied him for a moment, then handed Annie a small lunch bag. "Stay on the main street," she said. "And no racing across intersections." "Yes, Mama." Annie slipped her hand confidently into Edward's as they stepped out into the hallway. The morning air outside was crisp. They walked toward the corner where other children gathered near the crosswalk. Annie's pace was quick but relaxed, like someone who had made the trip many times. "School is 3 blocks," she explained. "That's convenient. Mama picked the apartment because of that." Edward nodded. "That sounds like her." They walked another half block before Annie spoke again. "Are you nervous?" Edward glanced down. "Why would I be nervous? You look like you're thinking too much." He smiled slightly. "That's possible." Annie considered that. "You don't have to be perfect," she said. Edward looked surprised. "I know, but adults act like they do. Sometimes." Annie kicked a small pebble along the sidewalk as they walked. "I just want you to keep showing up," she said. The simplicity of the sentence stopped him for a moment. I plan to. Annie nodded as if she had expected that answer. At the crosswalk, a few other children stood waiting with backpacks and lunchboxes. One boy waved to Annie. That's Daniel, she whispered. He thinks dinosaurs could beat sharks. Edward nodded seriously. That's an ongoing debate. Yes. When the crossing light turned white, Annie looked up at Edward. You can let go now, she said. Why? Because I'm almost at school. He released her hand slowly, but Annie didn't step away immediately. Instead, she looked at him carefully. You're really my father, right? Edward didn't avoid the question this time. Yes. Annie nodded once. Okay. That was all she said. Then she turned and jogged toward the school entrance where children were streaming inside. Halfway up the steps, she stopped and looked back. Edward was still standing on the sidewalk. She waved, not dramatically, just once. Then she disappeared through the school doors. Edward stood there for a long moment after she was gone. A strange mixture of joy and grief moved through him at the same time. Joy that he had walked her to school at all. Grief that it was the first time. A voice behind him broke the moment. She usually waves twice. Edward turned. Marissa stood on the opposite side of the street. You followed us, he said. She crossed toward him. I always watch until she goes inside. Edward nodded slowly. That makes sense. They stood side by side on the quiet sidewalk. The morning sun pushed through the clouds just enough to light the school windows. She likes you, Marissa said. She's giving me a chance. That's the same thing for Annie. Edward looked toward the school entrance. I should have been here years ago. Marissa shook her head gently. Regret is useful only if it changes what you do next. Edward considered that. And what should I do next? Marissa looked at him with calm clarity. Stay. He nodded once. I can do that. They stood there another minute watching the school doors. Then Marissa turned toward home. Edward walked beside her. For the first time in 18 years, the future did not feel like something he had to conquer. It felt like something he had to build, carefully, patiently, one morning at a time. Edward began coming by often after that morning. Not every visit was long. Sometimes he stopped by in the evening with groceries or books from a neighborhood shop Annie liked. Sometimes he walked Annie to school. Sometimes he simply sat at Marissa's kitchen table with a cup of tea and listened while Annie explained the politics of elementary school with the seriousness of a city reporter. He did not rush anything. That mattered. He did not arrive talking about lawyers, blood tests, or grand solutions. He did not try to buy his way into a role he had not earned. He showed up. And when he showed up, he stayed fully there. For Annie, that became the proof. For Marissa, it became the test. And for Edward, it became the first honest thing he had built in years. By the time November gave way to December, the air in Chicago carried that sharper kind of cold that made every front stoop and bus stop feel more exposed. One evening, Edward arrived with a wool scarf for Annie because she had mentioned, in passing, that the wind near the school made her ears hurt. Annie accepted it with calm approval and declared the color good enough for someone still learning. Marissa laughed from the kitchen. The sound stopped Edward for half a second. He had heard it in fragments these past weeks, quiet, careful, as if life had taught her not to give too much of it away at once. But every time it came, it carried him back to a younger version of himself standing under streetlights and believing there would be endless time to protect what mattered. There had not been endless time. There was only now. And now, at least, he intended to use well. One Saturday afternoon, Annie sat at the living room rug doing homework while Marissa sorted through mail at the table. Bills, school notices, a health insurance letter, a final notice from the old utility account she had already negotiated twice. Edward noticed the tightening in her face before she said a word. What is it? He asked. Marissa set the paper down. Nothing unusual. That answer told him enough. He reached for the letter. She let him take it, though not without a flicker of pride passing over her face first. He read it quietly. I can handle this, she said. Edward looked up. I know. Annie's pencil stopped moving on the page. That was how it had become in the apartment. Every conversation had two levels. The one on the surface, and the one Annie understood anyway. Marissa folded her arms. You don't have to fix every problem. No, Edward said gently. But I can stand beside you while you fix it. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, just as gently, she nodded. It was not surrender. It was trust. A few days later, Edward put Marissa in touch with a woman who ran operations at a private elder care network on the north side. Someone competent, discreet, and more interested in talent than pedigree. He did not call in a favor to hand Marissa a title she had not earned. He arranged an interview, Nothing more. Marissa came home from it guarded, thoughtful, unwilling to say too much. Then 3 days later, she walked into the apartment holding a folded letter in one hand and pressed the other to her mouth as if she were trying to contain the sighs of the moment. Annie looked up from the couch. "Mama." Marissa laughed once, then once more. And this time there was no caution in it. "I got it," she said. Annie jumped up immediately. "The job?" Marissa nodded. "The job." Annie launched herself at her mother with such certainty that even Marissa's exhaustion could not withstand it. She caught her daughter and held on, eyes shining. Edward stood by the doorway, not wanting to interrupt something sacred. Annie twisted around in Marissa's arms and looked at him. "You knew." "I hoped," he said. Annie pointed at him as though making a formal announcement. "You can stay for celebration dinner." Marissa smiled through the bright emotion in her face. "I think that can be arranged." That night's celebration dinner was spaghetti, garlic bread, and a store-bought pie. Annie insisted tasted more expensive than it was. The apartment felt warmer than usual, as if success itself had added a few degrees to the room. After dinner, Annie disappeared into the bedroom and returned holding something behind her back. "I made a new drawing," she said. Edward sat back slightly. "Should I be concerned?" "Yes," Annie replied. "It's emotionally serious." Marissa laughed again. Annie handed him the paper. This one was more detailed than the first. A house stood in the center, drawn in careful lines with flower pots by the steps. Marissa stood on one side, Annie on the other. And beside them, closer than in the first drawing, was Edward, not labeled the helper this time. This time the words beneath the tallest figure read, "Don't be late again." Edward stared at it. Then he looked up at Annie. "That," he said, "is fair. I know." He folded the paper carefully, more slowly than he needed to. Marissa watched him from across the table, one hand resting near the bracelet on her wrist. She wore it almost every day now. Sometimes Edward caught her touching it absent-mindedly while reading or thinking. The sight no longer hit him like a wound. It felt more like a promise he had once broken and now, perhaps, had been allowed to honor again. Later that evening, after Annie had gone to bed and the dishes were done, Edward stood with Marissa near the window while the city moved quietly outside. "She's sleeping easier," he said. Marissa nodded. "So am I." He turned toward her. "Do you regret telling her?" "No." She looked out at the street for a moment before continuing. "I regret the years that made truth feel complicated, but not the truth itself." Edward stood very still. "Marissa," he said quietly, "I don't expect things to become simple just because I'm here now. They won't. I know." She turned toward him then, the lamplight warm against one side of her face. "But simple isn't the same as real," she said. "And what we have now, however strange or late, it's real." He let the words settle. "Is that enough?" he asked. "For tonight?" She gave a small, tired, beautiful smile. "Yes." A week before Christmas, Annie insisted on walking them both down to the mailbox in the lobby because she had mailed a card to herself at school and wanted to see if the postal system could be trusted. While she checked the mail slots with theatrical suspicion, Edward and Marissa stood a little apart in the dim yellow light near the stairwell. "I still can't quite believe this happened because of a pawn shop," Marissa said. Edward smiled faintly. "Neither can I. She saved that 50 for almost a year," Marissa said. "Birthday money, Christmas money, little things." Edward thought about the first moment Annie had pressed it into his hand, the complete seriousness of her face, the impossible trust. She thought $50 could bring back something priceless, he said. Marissa looked toward Annie. "In a way," she replied. "It did." When they went back upstairs, Annie handed Marissa the mail and then tugged once on Edward's sleeve. "What?" Annie lowered her voice as if sharing state secrets. "You smile different now, too." Edward glanced toward Marissa. She was opening envelopes at the table, the bracelet catching the kitchen light. "Do I?" Annie nodded. "Yes. Like you finally found where you were supposed to knock." That night, after he left the apartment, Edward did not go straight home. He drove for a while through the city with no destination, past lit storefronts and church windows and families carrying bags through the cold. He stopped finally at a red light and reached into his wallet. Annie's first drawing was still there, worn now at the folds. 3 stick figures under a yellow sun. The helper. He thought of the second drawing too. "Don't be late again." At last he understood the strange mercy of it all. Life had not given him back the years. It had given him a door. A small apartment door in a brick building on the south side. A child brave enough to ask. A woman strong enough to tell the truth. a bracelet that had traveled all the way into a pawn shop just so memory could put on a coat and come looking for him. Some men spent their whole lives waiting for a miracle large enough to impress them. Edward Hale had found his in a folded $50 bill, and a little girl who believed love was something worth bringing home. The next Sunday, Annie left a note on the kitchen table before church. It was written in careful block letters. For the next time something important gets lost, don't wait so long. Edward read it twice and smiled. Then he slipped the note into his wallet beside the drawings. Not because he was afraid of forgetting, because the story is complete. The story reminds us that sometimes the bravest acts come from the smallest people. Annie believed that love, courage, and honesty were more powerful than money or status. Her simple determination to bring back her mother's bracelet became the moment that reunited a broken past and opened the door to a better future. The lesson for all of us is that life gives second chances when we are humble enough to face the truth and brave enough to show up for the people who matter. In the end, real wealth is not measured by money or success, but by the courage to care, the strength to forgive, and the willingness to stay when someone needs you the most. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.